As the Denver Broncos prepare for training camp at the end of July at the UCHealth Training Center, we take a look at one pivotal battle at the wide receiver position. How many wide receivers could Denver carry over the active roster in 2022? We break that down and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Happy Wednesday, and welcome back into a brand new episode, Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast here on the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day from the South Stands to the end zone. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, senior Broncos analyst at Mile High Sports, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. He's the site expert, predominantly orange.com. Broncos country, thank you once again for making Locked on Broncos your first listen of the day. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast provider, whether you're watching us on YouTube, we appreciate you so much. Make sure you hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on a day's worth of Denver Broncos news, content, and coverage. Sayre, our continuation of our training camp preview series happens here today. We're going to focus on the wide receiver position. Plus, we also have a little bit of Broncos news as it pertains to the ownership group and a brand new face being added to the mix according to the Walton-Penner Group. We'll break down all that and much more on today's episode of the show, my man. I'm excited to break down wide receiver, though, because it is a very loaded room.
It is, and it's my personal favorite position in football. I mean, I love the wide receiver position. I love watching guys get opportunities, see what they can do. I mean, the ball's in the air and it's coming your way. What are you going to do with your opportunity? And I think that we've just seen so many cool stories at the wide receiver position throughout Broncos history. I mean, when I was growing up, it was Rod Smith, the undrafted guy who was kind of just becoming a superstar, becoming arguably the best undrafted player in Denver Broncos history. And then there was guys, throughout the remainder of the 2000s, like Brandon Marshall, and just, I love this position, Cody. Demaryius Thomas, obviously the late great DT, and Eric Decker just absolutely torching defenses with Peyton Manning at the quarterback position. So I've long loved the wide receiver position, and I think the Broncos have maybe the best group that they've had since I've been a fan of the team, which I think, I mean, that's dating back decades at this point, which is kind of crazy to think about. But really, I mean, you look back at the Peyton Manning led teams, the 2012 team, the 2013 team when Wes Welker joined the fray, or even what you could go back to or go forward a little bit from that point with Emmanuel Sanders when he jumped on. I think definitely, Cody, this has a chance to be the best wide receiver group that the Broncos have had in the last two or more decades.
Well, and we talk about how loaded the room is. Really, there is no competition except for the back end part of this position, which is a really good thing. We already know Courtland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler. Those are the solidified top four wide receivers that you have. However, I think a lot is contingent on how many wide receivers the Broncos will carry on the active roster. That's something we'll discuss a little bit later on here in the show. But really, there's a battle for that fifth spot and that sixth spot. And you could even maybe make an argument, could there be a seventh spot that the Broncos do decide to throw in? Well, let's take a look at that wide receiver 5 spot, because this is where our focus is at Broncos camp here. And it features a matchup between two guys who are going to compete to secure that wide receiver 5 spot, which has a very, very pivotal role. If one of the major guys goes down with an injury, this person will be thrust into a more highly octane role. And if those guys aren't injured at any point and he doesn't have to step in and replace, this wide receiver 5 will still have some value on game days. It may be one catch for a big time play downfield. It may be a touchdown, but that's what that wide receiver 5 role is going to be. And that is going to come down between Kendall Hinton, Broncos fan favorite, Hall of Fame quarterback wide receiver Kendall Hinton, and Travis Fulgham, who had once caught lightning in a bottle with his time with the Philadelphia Eagles and has been really trying to find his footing ever since that season just a couple years ago.
What's crazy, if you search Travis Fulgham's name on Twitter, you'll see that he's still kind of a meme for Eagles fans, which is crazy to see. So I love this battle. Honestly, I think Kendall Hinton made great strides last year, and it was fun to watch him again. Remember the Cowboys game? Remember the touchdown that he scored against the Chargers? The opportunities that he got. He just showed to me that he's ready for an expanded role. And like you mentioned, Cody, this is really one of those things where you're one injury away from kind of playing a very prominent role in this offense. And the Broncos got exhibit A of that last year. You lose Jerry Jeudy in week 1, and then the next week you lose KJ Hamler. All of a sudden, wide receiver 5, which was Kendall Hinton, I believe, last year or something like that, they get thrust into a bigger role. And now all of a sudden you're a focal point in the offense. You're somebody that has to go out there and execute at the highest level. So I like this battle just because I feel like Kendall Hinton, he's kind of ascending. Travis Fulgham, like you mentioned, he caught lightning in a bottle. Really ask Trayvon Diggs about Travis Fulgham. That was an impressive game from Travis Fulgham at the wide receiver position, but it was really that 8-week stretch where he kind of became everybody's favorite fantasy football waiver wire pickup and was outstanding at that point. So that potential is there. Will he be able to recapture that lightning in a bottle? Will he be able to fend off somebody like Kendall Hinton, or I guess at this point surpass him? I love this position battle, and I think it's going to bring out some really intriguing competition, especially for the guys behind them as well.
I mean, coming into training camp, both players had really good offseason programs with the Broncos. They had a really good mandatory mini camp. They flashed, they excelled there. And, there's other players at the position, which we'll get to coming up here in just a moment. But really, I feel like the Broncos, if these guys, if Kendall Hinton and Travis Fulgham, if they're so close during camp, I mean, is it a harsh kind of contrast to maybe say that the Broncos don't keep both of them? Like, could you imagine if they do? Because it's extra security blankets. And Sayre, you mentioned it. Injuries. I mean, they can happen to you within a span of 2 weeks. You can lose 2 guys in one game. I mean, ask the New York Giants how they felt about all their wide receiver injuries they sustained last year. They lost 3 of their guys in one game as well. So a great insurance policy, and also for a guy who's not going to be a high-priced guy like Travis Fulgham. That is one of the more intriguing storylines and position battles to watch at training camp. But I think also Broncos country is very intrigued about Montrell Washington. How does he fit into the fray? Because last year the Broncos utilized Deontay Spencer as that wide receiver 6, even though he didn't have much of a role on the offensive side of the ball. He was their kick returner and he was their punt returner specialist. This is what Montrell Washington is expected to be, but he's going to have some competition from Jalen Virgil and Tyree Cleveland as well, just to name a couple guys.
He is, and I think there might even be some additional competition at the running back position. Maybe that undrafted rookie Tyreek McAllister. We'll talk about him in another episode. But when you're talking about the wide receivers up for the kick and punt return jobs, it all starts with Montrell Washington, the guy that nobody thought, including the guy himself that got drafted, nobody thought he was getting drafted. And definitely a surprise pick by the Denver Broncos to take a guy like this. But obviously, we all saw the Florida game. We all have seen the highlight reels, and it's really cool to see what he can do as an offensive weapon in addition to being a special teams weapon, because I think that had to be part of the motivation, right? To get rid of Deontay Spencer, who back in 2019, and we've said this before, he was really a godsend for that Denver Broncos special teams. Somebody out there that can actually catch a punt. I mean, we might as well have all bought Deontay Spencer jerseys at the time just because he could do that. And it was so refreshing to see, but you lacked a little bit of that playmaking ability last year. We saw a little bit of it in 2020 near the end of the season from him, but didn't quite see it last year. The Broncos near the bottom of the league in kickoff return yardage and punt return yardage as well. So you certainly want more of a playmaker back there, but I think part of the motivation to get somebody new is you got to have somebody that can be an offensive weapon, which could play into that numbers game that I know we're going to talk about here soon in terms of how many guys do you keep, because do you keep somebody who's just a specialist? The Broncos were kind of burned by that last year when they traded away Trinity Benson to the Detroit Lions. And yes, a phenomenal trade. You do it 10 times out of 10. But by the end of week 2, I wonder if the Broncos were wishing they still had Trinity Benson at least a little bit, just to say, hey, this guy was awesome for us in camp and the preseason. Now we've suffered 2 big injuries and we could really use him. Do you want to get caught in that situation again? That's what we're going to talk about here, I think, coming up when we talk about this numbers game a little bit.
Well, we're going to get into the numbers game coming up here in just a moment. We're going to project how many wide receivers we believe the Broncos will carry on the active roster in 2022. But before we do that, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode of the show. It's our good friends over there at Dave Folks. And level with me here. We've all been in a situation at some point in our lives where we were a little tight on cash, and maybe you can only afford to put a few gallons of gas in your tank or get another save the date, or you're wondering how to afford a gift. Well, that's where Dave can help you here today. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, it can be really stressful when unexpected expenses come up. Now, Dave can help you get out of a pinch when you really need it. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or to catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups with Dave here today. There's no interest and there's no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief that they need with extra cash here today. So if you're in a pinch and you need some extra help, download Dave and think of it as a helping hand from future you. Download Dave app from the App Store right now. That's DAVE. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly today. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer, fees apply, banking provided by Evolve. Member FDIC. Your future self will thank you. As we jump into the second half action on today's episode, Lockdown Broncos, we are breaking down and projecting the wide receiver room going into the active roster in the regular season, week 1 against the Seattle Seahawks here. But Sayre, we always have to take a look at how many players we think are going to be on this roster together. And I think it's very simple. I mean, when we break it down last year, the Broncos, they carried 6 total players at the position, but you also mentioned really just investing in one of those positions as a specialist, and that was Deontay Spencer. I feel like for this offense with Russell Wilson coming into the mix here, that's one thing they didn't necessarily have in Seattle during Russ's time there. They had DK Metcalf, they had Tyler Lockett primarily as the main 2 guys, but their wide receiver depth was mainly filled with a bunch of unknowns. When you look at Denver's playmakers right now, I mean, you look at wide receiver, they have so many guys that we feel like can contribute week in and week out. So ideally, as we talk about with starters on any position, you need adequate amount of backups to back up the starters in case something happens. So we take a look at the Broncos top 4. Okay, hey, there's Courtland Sutton, there's Tim Patrick, Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler. Okay, well, what are you going to do there? That's where Kendall Hinton, Travis Fulgham come into the mix. But then there's Montrell Washington, who I just imagine in this situation on paper, Sayre, I imagine his offensive role will probably be whatever KJ Hamler is doing, right? If something were to happen to KJ, he'd probably be thrust into that offensive role for this Broncos team. I mean, do you agree? Do you disagree? I mean, how does this make this a little bit harder for the Broncos personnel department in deciding how many wide receivers do we keep? First off, let me know how many you think Denver keeps on the active roster.
Cody, I would love to see them keep 7, honestly. And I think a lot of it has to do with just like we talked about before, that overall depth at the position, right? That's exactly what you want to see all throughout the season. And what you don't want to see is what we saw last year. Like we were talking about in the previous segment, you don't want to see, your team having to go out and get somebody like David Moore out of, off the street free agency group. You don't want to have to see them go after guys like John Brown, which, I mean, those guys have had their moments throughout their careers and everything, which is great. But you don't want to be scouring the waiver wire in the middle of a season with Russell Wilson as your quarterback at the wide receiver position. No, you want to definitely have those guys out there that you believe in, that you trust in, that you have faith in. Guys that we talk about all throughout the offseason, as we have with Kendall Hinton, who has been getting in some great work with Russell Wilson, who has certainly received a lot of positive attention from Russell Wilson and the coaching staff, and not just this coaching staff, but the previous one. Remember last year when Vic Fangio was asked about who's the most improved player on the team this year, he singled out Kendall Hinton as being the most improved player on the team. So you certainly don't want to get into a bad situation like last year where we dedicate an entire roster spot to a specialist, because you already have to do that 3 times over. You have to do that at kicker. You have to do it at punter and long snapper. So dedicating another entire position to a specialist, I don't love that idea. I do love the idea of Montrell Washington playing a similar role to KJ Hamler. Maybe in that regard, maybe Kendall Hinton plays a similar role to Jerry Jeudy. And then does Travis Fulgham or maybe somebody like Seth Williams come in and play a similar role to Tim Patrick and Courtland Sutton, different things like that. And the practice squad is going to be fascinating too. But I think, to me, Cody, 7 is that number that I know it's a bit of a stretch because not all teams keep 7, but I would like to see that for sure.
Okay, so 7, I'm in agreement with you there. So let's predict. We already know who the top 4 is. We've named that. But let's talk about who the 3 players are that the Broncos will keep. Additionally, alongside Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Jerry, and KJ. I'm going to give the first one. You said it, Kendall Hinton. He's the one guy I'm going to go with. Who's the second guy, in your opinion, that you will name as one of the reserve guys?
I think I'm going to go with Montrell Washington, right? He's going to be that guy that comes out and proves why the Broncos used a 5th round selection on him, why they drafted him as a return specialist, why the special teams coaches loved him, and why the offensive coaches, namely wide receivers coach Zach Azzani, believe that he can be, part of that group, part of that unit. I think definitely you start with Kendall Hinton, then you go to Montrell Washington, but who's going to be that 7th? If they do decide we're going to keep 7, who's going to be that 7th guy?
I mean, that's a tough one because you mentioned the guys is like Travis Fulgham. You mentioned Seth Williams, who we have a lot of excitement about as well. Could the Broncos maybe get away with stashing one of these guys on the practice squad is another question too, because you always have to factor in there's going to be other teams in the NFL that'll probably need some help at receiver once we get closer to the regular season. Outside of that, you have some other undrafted rookie free agents. You have a Brandon Johnson on the roster. He comes in at 6 foot. There's been some talk about him maybe making some plays. Trey Quinn's on the roster as well. He's got some experience here in the National Football League. But when you talk about what fits this offense, I mean, you're really trying to figure out who is the best mold. And I think that seventh guy, Sayre, if I had to pick here today, if I'm the Broncos, I'm keeping Travis Fulgham on the active roster, and I'm hoping I can stash away a guy like Brandon Johnson or Trey Quinn or Seth Williams on the practice squad, because the Broncos will get more the ability to elevate one of these guys due to the new rules that the NFL has applied to the CBA that worked out really well due to COVID. You can protect more guys. You can have more guys on your practice squad. So I'm going to go with the safe bet here, Travis Fulgham, because of the plays that he's been making so far this offseason. And that will round out our 7 projected players on the Broncos wide receiver position we believe will be carried on into the active roster going into that week 1 matchup against the Seattle Seahawks in the showdown with former Broncos quarterback Drew Lock, Noah Fant, and our good friend Shelby Harris. We definitely miss Shelby in Denver here and wish him the best here. That's going to be a fun week 1 matchup. We'll be there at the game for Monday Night Football as the Broncos open up their season here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But Broncos country, coming up here in just a moment, a new face has been added to the Denver Broncos ownership group. What might this mean for the team, and how should Broncos fans potentially look at this? We dive into that and much more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, let me just tell you, if you're a Colorado sports fan, we have a show for you on across all professional sports. If you're a Rockies fan, we have a Locked On Rockies podcast. If you love the Colorado Avalanche, who just won a Stanley Cup, we have the Locked On Avalanche podcast hosted by Chris Maselli and Kyle Sullivan. Plus, you know, you want to catch up with the Nuggets Summer League action right now. Adam Matas and Matt Moore have you covered with the Locked On Nuggets podcast, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network. As we jump into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Once again, Broncos country, thank you so much for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day all year long, because for the true fan, there is never an off season. We have you covered every single day with all the orange and blue content and coverage that you need all in one place, whether you listen to your favorite podcast and provider or whether you watch us here on YouTube. We appreciate you so much, Broncos country. Sayre, on Monday, the Walton-Penner Group, who are now in the transition process of becoming the controlling owners of this Denver Broncos franchise, it's still going through its final realms of approval, which is expected to go through without any hiccups. It's just a process that takes some time, which is why we've had no formal announcement, no formal press conference set in stone yet for this to happen. But they made a move on Monday of this week by announcing Condoleezza Rice as one of the ownership group candidates coming in here. They've invited her to be part of it as well. And for, I think for this Broncos team, what might it mean? And I want to give some background here, Sayre, on Condoleezza Rice. It's been long said for a while, like just even a few years ago, I saw rumors and I saw reports coming out that she was maybe in line. She had aspirations of being the NFL commissioner one day. That's all certainly possible in the near future. You know, who knows how long Roger Goodell wants to run the show here for the National Football League. But for Rice, she has such an extensive knowledge of the game of football itself, and it's something that has been brought up consistently. And she also appeared this past year on the Manning Cast, where she talked about where she learned about football. Her father was a high school football coach and an educator in Alabama, so she grew up watching the Cleveland Browns. She grew up as a fan of the Browns. She grew up as a fan of the Alabama Crimson Tide, but her father taught her so much about offense and defensive schemes. So she's very smart when it comes to the X's and O's side of football. But she also brings a very strong business acumen to the table as well here. And so now she's coming on alongside Melody Hobson, the Penner Group. And now we just starting to wonder, could Peyton Manning potentially be next here?
I think that's the interesting thing about you bringing up her making an appearance on that Manning Cast. Kind of thickens the plot a little bit, doesn't it? I think it's just a great all-around bit of news for the Denver Broncos, for the Denver community. As we learned from the press release, her family moved to Denver a long time ago. But like you said, there was some involvement potentially with the Cleveland Browns a couple years ago. I remember those rumors kind of popping up, and it seemed so random at the time. I can't remember if it was specifically for like the coaching job or if it was the general manager, head coach. Yeah. So shout out to Patrick Coyote, our good friend who threw in the PO chat one of the greatest Browns coaches of all time, Condoleezza Rice. I thought that was pretty funny. I remember those rumors popping up, and it's great to see her finally getting into the NFL in this way. And like, to me, having a seat at the ownership table could be a great way for her to get into, if she wants to one day be the NFL's commissioner. How cool would that be to see somebody come from the ranks of the Denver Broncos to ultimately become the NFL commissioner? I just think the Broncos have a really good group being formed here, being built and developed. And I can't wait to see where these conversations continue to progress, just because, like you said, we haven't had a formal press conference at this point, and we view that as an eventuality, right? That's eventually going to come. But by the time that does come around, who else is going to be in this group? Because we already have everybody very excited about Melody Hobson and her husband, George Lucas, who is obviously the Mr. Star Wars himself. Then you've got the Walmart group, the Walton-Penner, and now you've got Condoleezza Rice. So you're blending a lot of different backgrounds for people, different places of leadership and influence, and just being able to be a strong voice in a very, Titan-sized industry. So these people, while they're new to the NFL, they're certainly not going to be new to having the hard conversations that come along with being an NFL owner or part of an ownership group. So I'm excited about this, Cody. I think it's great for the Denver Broncos, great for the community, great for the NFL.
I'm sure we're going to get a lot of political comments on our YouTube feed for bringing Condoleezza Rice up. I have no interest in talking politics, folks. I don't need to know about your political preferences. I don't care about sharing mine because, in my opinion, it's pointless. This is a sports podcast, so we're going to leave it at sports here. I do think Condoleezza Rice is going to add a little bit of a global footprint towards the Denver Broncos. And I think a lot of it, too, is we see, Sayre, with more women being involved in the sport of football, whether it be like Kelly Klein, who's on the football administrative side of things. We're seeing more women's influences in NFL front offices, which is huge. We're now starting to see the element of ownership here, obviously with Melody Hobson being involved, Condoleezza Rice. I mean, the evidence of women ownership, minority-owned franchises is now becoming a little bit more concrete here for this Denver Broncos team and for the state of the National Football League. But more importantly, even the presence, you have an advocate in Rice who's really big on allowing coaches to grow inside this profession. And she even noted on the Manningcast when she appeared, she's loving seeing that these women are getting opportunities to coach. And she's looking forward to seeing women get position coach jobs, because then that puts them in line for potential coordinator jobs. And could we eventually see a female coordinator in the National Football League here in the next couple of years? She's going to be a big voice behind that. But not only that, a strong business acumen on her behalf. I imagine her presence and her influence is going to be really focused on the business initiative side of things here for this Broncos team, but more importantly, global expansion for the league itself. I think the NFL will utilize her and her expertise in many ways, especially expanding to the global audience, not just male viewers, but also female viewers who are becoming more and more interested in football, and that needs to be highlighted a little bit more than it already is. So this is a big move here for this Denver Broncos team. Broncos country, let us know what you think down below in the YouTube comment section. But that'll wrap up today's episode. Lockdown Broncos here in your favorite podcast and provider. Tomorrow's episode of the show, we continue our training camp position preview as we take a look at the linebacker position for this Denver Broncos team. Who will get the start right next to Josie Jewell here in 2022? We break that down. We take a look at the room and some of the key backups on tomorrow's brand new episode, Lockdown Broncos.